The head of the African Union has said Ethiopia's warring parties have agreed to peace talks. It looked like the long-running conflict between the government and the Tigrayan rebels in the TPLF was actually intensifying as government forces advanced. But now there are going to be these talks in South Africa, so what might they achieve? Well, Getachew Reda is the TPLF spokesman. Well, first of all, why has the TPLF agreed to the talks?
We have been consistent to a fault when it comes to our preferences for peace as a strategic choice, because war was imposed on us. It was not our choice in the first place.
Right, but at the more tactical level, you do have concerns about these talks. You say that you were not really given advance warning of what was involved in the talks, and you may have some conditions for the talks.
What we asked for are clarifications, because peace is in our strategic interest. We'll say yes to any peace initiative. But the way it was handled was, as it turned out, something that wouldn't exude confidence. I mean, like AU leaking a letter, it just doesn't make any sense without consulting us. They didn't even tell us, what passport am I going to carry? Well, obviously, they wouldn't expect me to board a plane. So these are the kinds of things they should have done, and they didn't.
Well, no doubt there are lots of protocol issues which need to be resolved from what you're saying. But on the substance of these talks, do you believe it will be possible to agree at least a truce while dialogue continues?
We have had some informal talks with the government for quite some time now. So the first order of business is for cessation of hostilities to hold, and then other things will be taken care of. I wouldn't mind meeting with people to clearly work out the agendas. But yes, it is possible to have cessation of hostilities and then discuss other substantive matters. But cessation of hostilities is very critical.
If the protocol matters are resolved and a truce is agreed, as you seem to suggest is likely, you'll then be getting on to the substance of the dispute. Do you believe that your organisation is in a position to really assert its agenda, because you seem to be on the back foot?
Come again? We have an agenda. First is permanent ceasefire, where security arrangements need to be worked out between our two sides, and this needs to be negotiated. Second, there are other matters that need to be taken care of, because this is an essentially political problem, and a political problem needs to be resolved politically. Some kind of inclusive national dialogue, of course, international sanctions dialogue would be in order. But first and foremost, we have to agree on the architecture of the negotiations process, because it's not something you address through what you would call a kumbaya diplomacy. You just say hi to each other, and all of a sudden the problem would go away.
When you talk about that substantive agenda, which you say you have, are you envisaging some kind of permanent role for the TPLF in the institutions of government?
We're not interested in the corridors of power in Addis Ababa. We're not interested in taking the mantle of power in Addis Ababa. We are only interested in what happens in Tigray. But to the extent that whatever happens in Addis Ababa is going to affect what is going to happen in Tigray, would want to have some role. Otherwise, we're not interested in power.
And what sort of settlement in Tigray will you be pressing for in terms of territorial settlements and other issues?
Look, Tigray doesn't require a different arrangement. The constitution clearly recognizes some territory which obviously belongs to Tigray, and then Tigray's authority needs to be restored. The people of Tigray should be allowed to exercise their full measure of self-determination rights. The whole genocide issue needs to be taken care of. We will not be in the business of determining who goes to court, who gets to be accountable, but there has to be some modicum of arrangement where accountability issues could be taken care of.
And just give me your assessment of where this is likely to go. I mean, you may get a truce, you may even get a more permanent ceasefire, but when you get onto these more difficult issues you're discussing, presumably you're not terribly optimistic that there's going to be any significant settlement, are you?
It's quite simple. If there is willingness on the part of the authorities in Addis Ababa to settle this issue peacefully, they will have to somehow liberate themselves from the whims of the regime in Asmara, for example. But it's not for me to dictate whether Abiy should take orders from Isaias or should liberate himself. What matters to us is whether there is willingness on the part of the authorities in Addis Ababa to resolve this issue peacefully. Once there is that resolve, the rest would fall in line.
And that was Getachew Reda, spokesperson for the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Well, we put in a request to speak to the government, didn't receive a response. We can, though, speak to Dr. Adam Adebe. He's senior advisor at International IDEA. It's an intergovernmental organisation based in The Hague in the Netherlands, and the talks seem to be on in South Africa. Do you think anything will come of them beyond perhaps, a truce?
Well, I think a truce will be a significant achievement. But from our experience, we've had occasions where the parties were thinking about considering talks, and they have not, unfortunately, produced any major breakthrough. And so, we'll be legitimate, will be acceptable to be optimistic at this stage, partly because both sides have been trying their best on the military front, and that has not worked so far. So a truce, if it is achieved at this particularly at this early stage, it would be significant. And I think the African Union in particular, considering the criticisms and other complaints that it has been receiving, it would be very keen to come out with something, with something to sell to the world.
Who else will be involved in South Africa? Will Eritrea be playing any role in the talks?
Not directly. As far as I know, at this stage, there has not been any direct invitation for the participation of Eritrea. But I anticipate that down the line, they would have to be involved, partly because the African Union Special Envoy, former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo, has clearly suggested that Eritrea is not just an outsider, it's a party to the conflict. And if the conflict is going to receive a sustainable solution, they would have to be on the table as well. And so at this early stage, I don't think they'll be part of it. But we can understand that they have communicated their wishes, they have communicated their positions already to their counterparts in Ethiopia.
Right, and Getachew Reda spoke about genocide, reparations, these big issues that the TPLF want addressed. But I mean, is there any indication that's going to happen?
Well, I think so there has to be a mechanism to account for what happened. In terms of the nature of it, but as Getachew said, this is a complex issue. All this violence is not just ordinary criminality, but it has been happening within a context of complex politics. And so there has indeed to be an accountability mechanism, but the exact nature of it, I think, would have to be part of the peace process itself. So we cannot anticipate exactly how it's going to unfold, but the parties would have to agree how, in particular, how to address the victims that have suffered, but also to hold those that are responsible accountable. So the mechanisms, the exact mechanics would have to be sorted out through negotiation, but there has to definitely be an accountability mechanism.
Okay, well, thanks very much for your assessment of those talks due to start in South Africa on Monday under the auspices of the African Union. That was Dr. Adam Adebe speaking from The Hague.